Uh, my name is Tenzin Lekshe, and I'm moderating this fourth panel, the last panel of the Geneva Forum 2023. The topic for this theme is China's global footprints, surveillance, and transnational repressions. I will not go in detail because we have three eminent speakers over here from different backgrounds. And we live in a very interesting, degenerating times of conflicts we've witnessed over the last few months, few years. And we see how China also grows and takes its own chances to be prominent by using their own tactics and pressures and sinister programs, which happens not just in China, but all over the world. So therefore, this is a very important topic to be discussed. Actually, being a Tibetan for this movement, while resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict, we felt that it is not just about Tibetan cause. If Tibetan issues has to be resolved, if the Tibetan conflict has to be resolved, the global political issues is very much part of it. So therefore, in this session, when we talk about China's global footprints, there are many things that China has been involved so far over the years under the leadership of Xi Jinping, as he being self-imposed himself as being the lifelong leadership of China. So we'll go with the first speaker, Ms. Yaqiu Wang. Right. And she is the research director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, leading the organization's research on human rights issues within China and on the Chinese government's global influence. Wang has been frequently quoted in many news outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journals, and The Guardian, and had appeared in many international news medias. She also published articles in Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, Global Times, Global Mails, and Unquote, and elsewhere, and testified many a times before U.S. Congress, and has served as a guest speaker at numerous universities. Prior to joining Freedom House, Wang was senior China researcher at Human Rights Watch, working on issues including internet censorship, freedom of expression, protection of civil society and human rights defenders, and women's rights in China. So I'll not go in detail, so I will let Wang to speak for 20 minutes. So we have 20 minutes for all the speakers, and before winding up, I'll reign 5 minutes before. Thank you. Wang, is for you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's my first time in Geneva. It's a very pretty city, even the weather doesn't look very nice. I'm here to represent Freedom House and to talk about transnational repression. It's one of the key projects Freedom House has conducted over the past 3 years. It's a global project on transnational repression. And you can imagine that obviously China is the biggest violator of transnational repression. I'm going to give an overview of the situation, highlighting some key aspects. Then I will spend the most of my chunk time to talk about how we should address it, because I think for people who are here, the awareness is high, but the key is how governments, civil societies, and the technological companies can do to mitigate the harm created by transnational repression perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. So China conducts the most sophisticated global and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. There's no doubt China is number one, and number two is not even close to the scale China has, the scale and depths of transnational repression by the Chinese government. There are 5 characteristics of China's transnational repression. First is just the campaign targets many groups, including the ethnic and religious minorities, obviously the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, and also political dissidents, anyone who criticize the government, activists, journalists, and those are, the sort of the Chinese government's enemies. But not just the, what we traditionally think the people who the Chinese government doesn't like. It's also including the people who are used to be in the government. Now they are being accused of corruption or other, illegal dealings. Now they became the new enemies of the Chinese government, and those people are also targeted by the government in a systematic way. The second character, I would say, is that just the spectrum of the tactics the government use, including, the ones we already know, like harassment, intimidation. I know many cases of Tibetan groups go to a protest or participate in certain public events, then they will see, people are taking videos of them. Those are very, very common tactics. And then there are people who are, receive calls and being told, be careful. If you say certain things, your family members will be in danger. Those are very, obvious harassment, intimidation. Then there are also the ones that involves foreign governments. The Chinese government, compel foreign governments. Usually, those governments are in some way beholden to the Chinese government to detain, then render those dissidents and exile people who are in exile. And the other very obvious component of the tactics is the digital transnational repression, the use of spyware. Yesterday, Citizen Lab gave some shout-outs to Human Rights Watch for our work. I used to work at Human Rights Watch. Now today I will return the favor. Citizen Lab had worked with Tibetan groups to monitor the cyber attacks over overseas Tibetan activists. One notable case Citizen Lab documented was that people who posed as human rights workers and journalists, they contacted senior figures in the Tibetan groups over Facebook or WhatsApp, and then use cover stories, quite believable cover stories. They try to get the targets to click the links of websites that are already installed with spyware. So the Tibetans known to have clicked the links were protected by patches that had issued for security flaws and had updated their phones. So this has been, a project that Citizen Lab has worked with Tibetan groups in order to protect them from being attacked by that kind of a cyber-based, transnational repression. The other, key component of cyber-based transnational repression is the use of WeChat, because we all know that international platforms are all blocked in China. So in order to connect with people inside the country, in Tibet or anywhere elsewhere in China, you have to use WeChat. Then anything you say on WeChat, even when you're abroad, anything you do, like any kind of activity you coordinate on WeChat are being monitored by the Chinese government. The third characteristic of the China's transnational repression is that it's embedded in a broader framework of influence that encompasses cultural association, diaspora groups, and in some cases, organized crime networks. I think Josh probably later will talk about the United Front. So the transnational repression is just one part of a very big, campaign or systematic activity of trying to influence the diaspora. Transnational repression sounds repression sounds bad, but some of the activities are much more, you don't know, it doesn't look that bad, but it can have malign intent, it looks like some diplomatic activities. Some local Chinese diaspora groups reached out to local officials to have some kind of, like friendly meetings, and then they have hidden agendas. So the transnational repression is just one part of this overall, overseas influence activity. The last one is that the Chinese government leverage its own economic power, its geopolitical weight, to assert influence over other countries. A lot of those countries, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, such as Nepal and Thailand, and also in Africa, because a lot of African countries depend on China for economic projects. Kenya, or in Middle East too, in Latin America, because of the economic ties. This really, it's not just Chinese government is doing the transnational repression. Chinese government is able to force or co-opt other governments to carry out its agenda that other countries, even smaller countries such as Turkey or Saudi Arabia, they just don't have that kind of political clout to do that kind of transnational repression. So obviously, given the scale of Chinese government's transnational repression, you can see how many people are targeted. Not just Chinese citizens. There's, even criticals of Chinese government who are not Chinese citizens, especially people of Chinese ethnicities, academics who criticize the government, journalists who criticize government, who are not tied to China. They are also being targeted by the Chinese government. So you can see just the people who are the targets of this campaign. It's not that that's just the effects of the China's transnational repression. It's just because Beijing is so influenced that it's also just by doing it so systematically, it's able to reshape the legal system and the international norms to its interests. So I think that's, it's beyond its very near-term goal of, I wanted to silence those people. I want those people to be, my allies, not my adversaries. It's about how do you undermine over time through its systematic operation over time undermines the international norms. In the past several years, Freedom House has been spoken with various governments, especially the U.S. government, in terms of how to address transnational repression by any countries, by China specifically. I think, first of all, governments need to establish a definition of transnational repression, so people know, when we talk about transnational repression, what that entails, what that means. Here is a definition that Freedom House proposed. I will read out. The term transnational repression describes the ways a government reaches across national borders to intimidate, silence, or harm an exiled refugee or member of the diaspora who they perceive as a threat and have a political incentive to control. Methods of transnational repression include assassinations, physical assaults, detention, rendition, unlawful deportation, unexplained or enforced disappearance, physical surveillance or stalking, passport cancellation or control over other documents, Interpol abuse, digital threats, spyware, cyber attacks, social media surveillance, online harassment, and harassment or harm to family and associates who remain in the country of origin. So that's a lot of tactics are included in the definition. I think the point is that governments needs to have a consensus, at least within their own country, to define transnational repression. So a legal framework can be, designed to address this specific type of threats. Second, I think it's very important is to develop a plan to spread awareness among law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, and officials who are working on refugee and asylum issues. I think over years, whether when I was working at Human Rights Watch or now at Freedom House, people say that I don't, when I report to the local police of this person who was following me or who was, threat me, saying, if you still criticize the government in Australia, your family will be in danger. Then they wanted to report to the local police, and the local police, what's going on? Like, they have absolutely no awareness of that kind of transnational repression. So first, get your police force, your law enforcement to understand what's going on. Also, people who work on refugee asylum issues, they need to know, the context, the background of those people who are under threat. Another is to issue travel advisories about states that engage in transnational repression. So, the U.S. State Department has, you go on their website. If you want to go travel to a certain country, I came to Switzerland. I checked the website. It says fine, you can go there, right? It's it's a low safety issue country, but we advise the U.S. government and any other governments to make transnational repression country that systematically carry out transnational repression to be a category that in their advisories saying this country carry out high-level transnational repression, so people are advised about this when they travel abroad. Another very key issues related to the raising awareness within the law enforcement and the intelligence services to connect the law enforcement agencies with the targeted diaspora communities. Usually a lot of times people who fled their country to the U.S., to Switzerland, they came from a country, they're very suspicious of the police. They were targeted by the police to begin with, so they don't feel safe to talk to the law enforcement in the host countries. So how do you connect these two communities? For the law enforcement, how do you convey the message to, and how do you gain trust among those people who are being targeted that we are here to protect you, we're not here to harass you or give you the information to the Chinese government about you. Another big aspect of the response includes we need to track the incidence of transnational repression. I think the U.S. government is doing better and better on this. Like as a country, there should be whether the Congress or the Parliament needs to, designate this in their certain reports, State Department report, Department of Homeland Security reports to at least to track and publish those incidences of transnational repression and identify, the perpetrated governments. Then, there are so many reports being published, but, how do you disseminate the reports and make people aware, the government is tracking these reports. People can go to this website, can find out what's going on. So, Freedom House has been in contact with FBI about this issue, and they had this website, and there's this, transnational repression website talking about what they are doing, the cases they have found, how you can seek help from them. So it's a thing they have now. It's on their website, and they also have been carrying out the community engagement with various, Uyghur and Tibetan and other groups to, make people aware this is on their agenda. But, from what I heard, like people, feel, okay, FBI wants to talk. I don't feel safe to talk to FBI because I don't trust FBI. So I think the next step is for the FBI and any other law enforcement agencies to gain the trust of community. So, they feel, talking to FBI is okay, and FBI is not going to, make some reckless mistakes so my information get disclosed, something like that. So I think this is also is really key. In terms of how to how to deliver accountability, I think we need to impose targeted sanctions on perpetrators and the enablers of transnational repression. In the U.S., there's the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which impose travel bans and assets freezes on perpetrators of serious human rights violators. The U.S. government has sanctioned a bunch of Chinese officials who are implicated in the abuses in Xinjiang, also in Hong Kong. So we need more of that, of the targeted sanctions of human rights abuses, and needs that the targeted sanctions is carried out under the framework, those people committed transnational repression. Then I think I have 2 minutes. So the last point I want to mention is that oftentimes governments, wants to bust the bad people in the country by FBI, under framework of, national security. They can impose bans against human rights abuses. Oftentimes they don't do enough to help the people who are here to seek asylum and the refugees. So many times, U.S. officials ask me, how can we help the people here to empower them to speak their mind? Like I would say, the simple answer is to give them the legal status. They can help themselves as long as they can stay here legally. But this is just so hard to do it. I mean, I know even in Switzerland, it takes forever for asylum seekers to, gain legal status here. It's a problem around the Western countries. So, this is like my last message. Just don't pay lip service. Don't just publish your statements, criticize the Chinese government, the Saudi government. Do some real things to help the people here. You can do it. When I was at the Human Rights Watch, we worked a lot on the Australian asylum issues. Like, people are literally the asylum seekers were imprisoned in this little island. I always feel Australia is so big. You can just put those people in your huge country. It's okay. So my last message really, make people, the asylum seekers' life much easier. It's a very simple thing to do. Just let them stay here legally. They can help themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wang. You talk a lot about the transnational repressions happening not just in China, but all over the world. In fact, with the rise of China's communist regime, the visibility of these transnational repressions has gone hot all over the places, not just with China, but it exemplifies with other oppressed nations also, right? So therefore, it was very much important subjects which we need to understand and look into. And I would like to also compliment the works which the Human Rights Watch and Freedom House has been doing, are pioneering works for the oppressed people, right, to highlight the issues of the oppressed people, and I compliment that on behalf of the CDAs. And as it is aptly mentioned that when you talk about the surveillance and the transnational repressions, there's a word which says that nets in the skies, and traps on the ground, which is very much true, but it is everywhere. their visibility is everywhere, their connection is everywhere, their control is everywhere. And then we have to defend ourselves how to maneuver. So let me join in thanking Ms. Wang for the wonderful presentations. And next we have Josh Dawkins, and he's a columnist for the global opinion sections of the Washington Post, and he has authored Chaos and Heaven, America, China, and the Battle for the 21st Century, and it was released quite recently, right, in 2021 by the Marina Books. Previously, Josh has covered foreign policy and national securities for Bloomberg, Newsweek, Daily Beast, foreign policy magazine, Congressional Corridor. There are so many in this. There are so many lists, right?
You get the point.
So he's a big guy over here who understands China, Tibet.
Can't keep a job.
Right, and American foreign policies and all. So we are lucky to be have Josh over here. And Josh, interestingly, Josh has been recognized with the Interaction Award for Excellency in International Reporting and received journalism fellowships from the Knight Foundation. So I will not go in detail. So I will let Josh to have 20 minutes of his statement. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you all. I can't tell you how special and honored I feel to be invited to be a speaker here at the Geneva Forum. You know, it's really been a wonderful couple of days. I've met a lot of new friends. I've reconnected with some old friends who I haven't seen in a while, and I feel connected to this community, and I feel this community it's like an intellectual hug. It's like a warm hug, and I've really enjoyed my time here. You know, one of the things I've really found interesting in on the meals and in the coffee breaks is hearing everyone's story about how they got involved in this cause, how they came to it. Of course, many of you were born into it, but many of us weren't. And you know, a little bit about myself. You know, I started being interested in the issue of Tibet in 1998 when I was an undergrad in college, and my friend said, "Oh, they've got this concert. It's called the Tibet Freedom Concert. Let's go." And I was like, "Okay, that sounds like fun." And so we went to the Tibet Freedom Concert at RFK Stadium in the summer of '98. I was 19. I know that, Martin, you started your Tibet journey at 19. I think this was probably a couple years later. I don't want to presume, but my 19 was maybe not the same year as your 19, but not too far anyway. But we got to the concert and we were having a great time. And during the set of Herbie Hancock, the jazz musician, all of a sudden a lightning bolt struck out of the sky, and it struck a woman who was standing 20 feet from me. And I didn't see it, but it sounded like a gunshot. And then we turned around, and this woman had been hit by a lightning bolt. And she turned out to be okay, but the whole concert stopped, you know. And I just thought to myself, wow, the spirit of the Tibetan people is really strong. And there must be something interesting going on here. And you know, I continued to follow it through college, and then I lived in Japan for a while, and I came back and I started working as a journalist for a Japanese newspaper, and then working in Congress for an American newspaper. And one of the first things I covering Congress was in 2007, the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I was there, and I wrote about it, and I remember distinctly, like it was yesterday, there was George W. Bush, Robert Byrd, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell. I had never seen these people from these different stripes of U.S. politics agree on anything, okay, ever. But they all agreed on this. And Nancy Pelosi said that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had brought peace and unity to the U.S. Congress. For the first time I had seen it, and probably for the last time, to be honest. And that was 2007. So then I started writing about it and, you know, trying to educate myself over the years. That eventually led me to the 2017 550 Forum in Dharamsala. That was my first time traveling to Dharamsala. And I, you know, we had a few days of workshops and this and that. And then His Holiness addressed the group. And I raised my hand and I said, you know, Josh Rogan, Washington Post. I said, you know, what do you think about Donald Trump? You know? And he just laughs, you know, and he says, well, I'm not going to do the voice, but he says, well, you know, when I first heard America First, I thought, not so nice. And then he laughs, you know. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, but, you know, I believe that the American people are good people and that they believe in democracy and freedom and human rights, and so I believe everything will be okay. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm not sure. That hasn't played out yet, but in the long run, I think and I hope and I believe that he's right. So that was the 550 Forum 2017, 5 years of keeping open up the door to dealing with Beijing, and then if that doesn't work, coming up with a 50-year plan for, that was the idea anyway at the time. Anyway, the 5 years is over, so now we're in the 50. So I think we're all settled in for what we, and by all of us, I mean all of the communities who are sort of dealing with what I like to call the international response to the problems associated with China's rise. And, you know, there are many communities and many countries working on this problem, and for the last 20 years or so, I've been trying to document it. That's a lot of what my book is about. But where it concerns this community, you know, transnational repression is one of the key issues. And what I'd like to do in my short time just up front here is to take you through some of my reporting on this issue over the last, let's say, 10 years in Washington. And my basic premise is that Washington has been slow to understand and then respond to China's massive expansion of international repression inside the borders of the United States. So that's what I know about. I know what goes on around the world, but what I'm going to talk about is what's going on inside the United States. And, you know, for the purposes of explaining to you how I think about this, I'm going to divide up the transnational repression into three different sort of sets, three different categories that I've documented. The first, and we've touched on some of these, but the first basically I see is surveillance and monitoring of overseas Chinese and of Chinese Americans who are civilians. In other words, Chinese Americans who are not activists, they're not in politics, they're just regular people trying to live their lives, but they happen to operate their lives in the Chinese language. And then overseas Chinese, which are like the hundreds of thousands, or at least what used to be hundreds of thousands of students mostly. And, you know, the second category is China's expansion of its practices and tools of repression on Americans, on regular, you know, non-Chinese Americans, and the use of repression tactics and curbs on discussion and free speech and other freedoms for Americans in America. And then the third is targeted harassment and violence against dissidents and perceived enemies of the CCP regime. And I'm going to explain to you why all those are different, but also how they're all sort of connected. All right, so I talk about the surveillance and monitoring of overseas Chinese and Chinese American civilians first, because I think that sort of came into the American consciousness first. And I'm talking now about 2016, 2017 time, and it really sort of exploded in many examples that I wrote about on campuses all over the United States. This is primarily a campus issue at first. We heard a little bit in the last panel about Chinese student associations, right? There are many different types of Chinese student associations. Some are benign, some are not. Some are connected to the Chinese consulate in wherever city that is, and some aren't, right? And so it's a complex set of relationships, but suffice to say that there are dozens that are not only working with, but also getting paid by the Chinese government or Chinese Communist Party outposts in various cities around America. It's been going on for a long time. It's a big problem. And we started to see the results of that in places like UC San Diego in 2017, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama was set to speak, and all of a sudden there was a student protest against it out of nowhere about how he's a terrorist and a separatist, and it was a big row. Of course, the university didn't know how to deal with it, and by the time they figured out what was the right thing and the wrong thing, it was too late. The damage had been done. But it's not there's another great example at the University of Maryland from around that time where an overseas Chinese student made a speech about enjoying the free speech that she enjoyed while she was on American soil, and she was roundly criticized and punished, right? Other good examples are like where Hong Kong activists try to speak at universities, they get shouted down, or there's protests against them. Same thing with Tibet events or Uyghur events on campuses. There's always some sort of organized protest. Again, some of them are linked to the Chinese government, some are not. But I would put forth that that's only one example of transnational repression by the Chinese Communist Party on American campuses. There are others. Another big one were the Confucius Institutes, okay? Hundreds of outposts of Chinese language and learning centers funded by the Hanban, the Chinese Education Ministry, which reports now up to the United Front Work Department. And, some of them were just teaching Chinese. I actually joined the one at George Washington University, just to check it out, and in the course of writing my book, I just signed up because I'm a George Washington University alumnus. I can audit the classes, so I just showed up for Chinese 101. And, it's just a bunch of kids learning Chinese. There wasn't really any corruption in that particular classroom. But other examples were way different, and I was able to report out stories of where there were actual intelligence surveillance missions going on at Confucius Institutes, where there were pressure campaigns, and then the most prevalent form of transnational repression dealing with Confucius Institutes came from the corruption in the donors. And this is a very hard thing to talk about because it's designed to be talking about. It's designed to be hard to talk about. We're talking about corrupt relationships between Chinese universities and the people who run some of these American universities who are getting paid in one way or the other. Sometimes it's just access, sometimes it's actual cash, sometimes they sell their house to this businessman from Hong Kong who pays 4 times what the house is worth, and then somehow they're the head of the Confucius Institute the next day. These are real examples. So when you put all that together and then you sort of look at the other ways that the Chinese government tries to surveil and monitor overseas Chinese and in America and Chinese Americans who are civilians, you get into all of the digital surveillance and the abuse of the platforms. So overall, the reason that this strategy is so pernicious and also so effective is because it's not illegal. And it should be, but it's not. And most of the rules for managing digital space, even though the people that are using that digital space are on American soil, are not written. And the accountability does not exist, and the reporting mechanisms aren't great. And when the Trump administration, for better or worse, tried to tackle some of these issues, and again, I'm not defending the Trump administration by any means. I wrote a whole book about how it was called Chaos Under Heaven because it was chaos. But suffice to say that they did try to first publicize and mitigate these issues, but they did it so poorly because they were the Trump administration. So just as one example, they banned WeChat. There was an executive order. It banned TikTok too. People only read about TikTok. But on the grounds, basically, that WeChat was, essentially violating, under their argument, U.S. law for censoring people on U.S. soil from the foreign headquarters, it was banned. But the ban was overturned by U.S. courts because, again, it was done so clumsily. They shut down a bunch of Confucius Institutes. A lot of them, I think 100 of them shut down. There was a legislative effort, there was a pressure campaign, there was exposure of some of the corruptions, and all of a sudden, Confucius Institutes all over the country started to shut down. And then a couple years later, they started to pop back up again with new names and new funding sources. Were they new funding sources? We don't really know. But anyway, the different names on the funding sources. So it's been a cat and mouse game, and I totally agree with what you said about the Chinese-speaking communities in Washington not having good access and good trust with the people in our government that should be dealing with that issue. So that's one thing. So then that sort of, as I was reporting that out, I started to notice around 2018 that the Chinese government was now exporting what you could call it the social credit system, or you could call it their effort to control the behavior and snuff out criticism of China to Americans. Okay? And this happened in a number of ways. It started at the corporate level. There was one crazy announcement where they said all of the airlines in the world, international airlines, have to change all their maps to make Taiwan and China the same country on the map. And you can't say you're flying to Taiwan anymore on your airline website. You now have to say you're flying to Chinese Taipei, and you got to do it now, and if not, you don't get to fly to China anymore. That's a pretty big tool of economic coercion. And in the U.S. government at the time, and I know we have some U.S. government, State Department representatives, they screwed the pooch. They didn't understand what was going on at the time. They didn't know how to react. And once the State Department finally kind of cobbled together a response to try to get these airlines to stand up to the Chinese government, it didn't really work. And you may say, okay, well, that's economic coercion, that's not transnational repression. But once the Chinese government realized that they could manipulate American companies, they used that realization to manipulate their employees. So the next example was, I don't know if you remember this, there was an employee in Omaha, his name was Ray, and he's like working the night shift at doing the Twitter for Marriott hotels. And he's the Twitter guy on the graveyard shift, okay? He's making $14 an hour. And while he was on shift, somebody retweeted a pro-Tibet tweet from the Marriott account. He says he doesn't remember doing it. Anyway, he got the blame for it. And they fired him. And there was a complaint. They shut down Marriott's websites in China for like 3 days, which if you run 1,000 hotels and you don't have any websites, you're in big trouble. It's a pretty big coercion stick. But now they're not just telling companies what to do. They're telling companies that your employees can't criticize China. Your employees no longer have free speech, though that they're Americans and they're on American soil. And, there was a little bit of outrage, but Ray didn't get his job back. Like, okay, well, that's, one guy. The moment it really entered the American consciousness in a big way was when China decided to punish the NBA. And I know you guys remember this story. Daryl Morey, who was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, was in Tokyo, and he tweeted, "Stand with Hong Kong," something to that effect. That was it. Stand with Hong Kong. They demanded he resign. When he didn't resign, they punished the NBA. They took the Rockets off the air. They took down all their TV. They cost them about $400 million that first couple of weeks. $400 million. Even for the NBA, that's a lot of money. Threatened to cancel their entire business in China, which was like the biggest growing part of the business, still is. Just for one tweet, okay? And at that point, there were a lot of Americans who were like, oh, wait a second, that's really screwed up. We can't tweet anymore? You're going to punish my whole company if I tweet one thing that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like? Basically, they were trying to silence any free speech that's anti-Chinese Communist Party by any American anywhere. So that, at least there was some outrage and there was some pushback, and I think eventually they sort of cut a side deal, and the NBA half apologized and they half forgave them, and life went on. But the transnational repression didn't stop. And this leads me to the next part, which is the targeting and harassment and violence against actual activists and dissidents on U.S. soil. Because, after I wrote about that NBA story, a group of Uyghurs in Washington and Virginia came together for the first Rockets game against the Wizards in D.C., first one of the season. And we decided to go there, and they all wore shirts with letters on them that said, Google Uyghurs, okay? And if you remember, one of the things the NBA did to try to make the Chinese government happy was they banned anyone holding up any pro-Hong Kong signs. People were wearing Tibet shirts, they got thrown out. People wearing Hong Kong shirts, they got getting thrown out of basketball games for, so they made a rule. They said, there's no political signs. It's not really about China. We love, free speech, but it's sports. We're not going to have any political signs. And but nobody can have a political sign. So the Uyghurs had a smart idea. They said, well, if we just say Google Uyghurs, that's not politics. That's an educational message. Just Google it. Google it. See what happens. Okay, and that's it. You can't tell me that that's a political message, can you? So I was there for the Washington Post covering it, and so they spelled out Google Uyghurs in the stands. And I wrote an article about it. We took pictures and everything. And, the NBA people, they were pissed off, and they tried to get us to leave, but we were like, no, screw you. We're not going anywhere. And they're like, all right. And then outside after the game, they were singing chants, Google Uyghurs, Google Free Hong Kong, Educate LeBron. I don't know if you remember LeBron said that, Daryl Morey wasn't educated enough, And sort of we got to educate LeBron, And a guy comes out, and I had been tweeting about this, and I have a moderately large Twitter following at this time. And with the videos and everything, it had kind of gone a little bit viral while we were at the game. So now we're outside after the game, and, people are digging it. They're like, yeah, you know what I mean? Fuck genocide, you know what I mean? They were with us. It was working. And a guy comes out of around the corner and walks right up to one of my friends, a well-known Uyghur activist whose mother is in a camp, and walks right up to, it's on tape, walks right up to him and says in Chinese, it was a Chinese guy, it says in Chinese, your mother's dead. Okay? Now, the odds that a random person picked the one person in the group who had a mother in a camp and then threatened that person to his face, which we have on video, that his mother was going to die because of his activities there, that's a whole nother level of transnational repression, okay? That's the targeted harassment and violence against dissidents and activists and anyone perceived to be an enemy of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's really the thing that's ballooned in the last couple of years. And it's really crazy, okay? It's really getting out of control. I could mention the Hong Kong bounties, right? We have a lot of Hong Kong students and young activists who live in the DC area, including Anna Kwok, who I spoke on a panel with last week. And she's got $1 million bounty on her head, okay? Nothing to do with Interpol, nothing to do with red notices. They just issued you're guilty, now anyone who can bring you in or help us bring you in gets $1 million. It's $1 million Hong Kong dollars, okay, fine. It's only like really $125,000, but still, it's really unprecedented. And that was one thing. Another thing was the police stations, right? Hong Kong, Chinese Communist Party police, Fujian local provincial police, setting up they had pictures, they had official badges, they had uniforms, just operating in the middle of Manhattan like it's no big deal. And what are they doing? Of course, they're investigating and hunting down and harassing and perpetrating violence against dissidents of all kinds. And that's totally illegal, okay? The first things that I told you are not illegal. They should be. Surveillance and monitoring, it's kind of like considered espionage. It's kind of considered interference. It's not technically illegal. It should be. Telling Americans they can't tweet or we're going to ruin your company, that should be. But when you're actually operating a police station in the middle of Manhattan and then hunting down people and beating them up and arresting them, that's a whole nother level of transnational repression, okay? And we've been very slow to deal with that. And when I wrote about the Justice Department finally going into there and shutting that down, the most interesting part of that story was not that the police station was allowed to exist for so many years, not that these people were allowed to roam the streets pretending that they're law enforcement when they have no right to that privilege in America, but where was the police station? It was in the middle housed inside of a building that was a Chinese-American nonprofit organization, okay? And that Chinese-American nonprofit organization was duly registered, run by Chinese Americans, but also funded by the United Front, also funded by the CCP. In other words, it was a proxy for the Chinese government. And that Chinese-American non-governmental organization was paying congressmen and mayors and senators and campaign contributions. And that's the real level of transnational repression organization that we're dealing with. And one of those was Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, who was at the gala for this organization. He didn't go there for free. Another one, there were congresswomen there who said, oh, wow, this and that. And of course, when certain congressmen pointed this out, they were attacked as being racist or xenophobic or what have you. So when I think we talk about transnational repression, eventually we're going to have to talk about the money. And I'm going to stop because I know I'm out of time, but I want to leave you with this thought. Billions and billions of dollars that are used for United Front work inside the United States. Every country, too. Every country you live in, they have this, but I can only know about the United States. Billions of dollars to set up Confucius Institutes, student associations, corporate joint ventures that are used as pressure, police stations, fake UN organizations, fake local Chinese-American NGOs, political donations. That's the root of the problem. Until we tackle the corruption inside of our own system, the Chinese government or any other government that seeks to exploit our democracy to use our openness against us is going to be able to succeed. And I look forward to talking with you more about this in the Q&A, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. And you got a good eyesight, actually, because like in U.S. Congress, the Tibetans all through the decades, right, we got a bicameral and bi-party supports for Tibet. So, and we are grateful to the U.S. Congress for supporting the Tibet movements all through the time. And in fact, it was quite interesting because like when you said that when the world is infested with corruption, then the regime tends to move on and get a space of these transnational repressions. right? It was quite interesting. And world is already corrupted. And China maneuvers to make sure that their transnational repression succeeds. And another interesting thing, at the end of your speech, China spends lots of money, not inside China, but outside China, right? But when I look into that, there is a saying that China spends lots of money, more money on internal security than outside, like defense, right? When China spends more internal security budget than the defense budget, and then on top of that, they are spending this budget, extra amounts. So that means that China is pulling so much of efforts in their acceding to the power. So it is a kind of risky one, actually. So I thank you, Roj, for the wonderful presentations. And now we'll go to Dr. Hardin. And Dr. Hardin is a Tibetan born and raised in India. She joined the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is a premium institute or learning center in India, and earned a PhD on East Asian studies, actually, on China studies, most briefly on Tibetan issues. And she is currently working as a fellow, research fellow in the Tibet Policy Institute of the Central Tibet Administration. And before that, she worked in the Indian Institute, which is called the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, which is based in India. It's a think tank based in India. So, and she had published many chapters, presented many papers all over the world. And then she's currently has been elected as the executive member of the International Seminar of Young Tibetologists. So, Dr. Hardin, you have 20 minutes to go. Thank you.
Tashtele again, and very good afternoon. Let me first thank you, Lishla, for the kind introduction. Let me first thank the organizer, the Department of Information and International Relations of the CTA, and the Tibet Bureau of Geneva for your kind invitation. I'm indeed humbled to be part of the Geneva Forum 2023 and to be part of this panel, sharing this panel with Josh and Ms. Wang. Since I'm the last speaker, I think there's a lot of pressure for me to be closing the show, as they would say in show business, right? So the theme of this session today is China's global footprints, surveillance and transnational repression. And as you have heard from both the speakers today, both Josh and Ms. Wang talked about how China has used repression techniques and strategies to control and surveil people beyond its border. So what I wanted to do in my presentation today is to think about repression, not just in everyday arena of surveillance and coercion, but rather to engage with the idea of transnational repression at the level of foreign policy, at the level of international relations, and at the level of normative values. So in order to throw more light on this issue, I would like to take the case study of the One China principle and the changes of the translation of the concept vis-a-vis China's domestic and foreign policy narrative. So before I go any further, I thought I would like to take this opportunity to give you a very brief understanding of what this One China principle means. So this principle is the position of the People's Republic of China on Taiwan, and to state that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China, and that the Communist Party of China is the only legitimate government of the whole of China, that is One China. But on the other hand, we see that the One China policy is the policy, not principle, but the policy, is a policy adopted by the United States after 1970, when right after China, People's Republic of China was established officially, and that they accepted at the time, that Taiwan was part of China. And United States continued to maintain this so-called unofficial relations with Taiwan. But since then, we see that subsequently, various other countries also have their own one China policy vis-a-vis China, right? So I began my presentation here with a statement brought out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, dating back to August 2022. And this statement was actually a response to the then US Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The second paragraph of the statement reads, and I quote, "There is but one China in the world, and Taiwan is an inalienable part of the Chinese territory, China's territory, and that the government of People's Republic of China is the sole legal government representing the whole of China." And this has been recognized by the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758 of 1971. Since the founding of the PRC in 1941, 181 countries have established diplomatic relations with China based on the One China principle. The One China principle is the universal consensus of the international community and a basic norm in international relations. So this was the quote. So this statement clearly outlines the intent of the People's Republic of China by calling One China principle a universal norm, accepted norm. The intention, so to speak, is to equate this One China principle with other universally accepted norms and principles like human rights, like religious freedom, democracy, sovereignty, and so on, which is an outlandish claim to be really honest. But before we go any further from here, I thought it is important I thought it is important to understand the difference between principle and policy, the two concepts, because it is highly imperative to highlight the difference between these two concepts, since there is an increasing tendency on the media outlets, and especially the scholars who are writing on this particular issue, to interchangeably use these two concepts without recognizing the importance of the fundamental difference between principle and policy. Within the international relations, as we speak of principle, norms and principles have a very different nature compared to policies. Whereas principle is concerned, principle is a very rigid idea that they are not very susceptible to change, as norms are universally accepted and adopted in the international relations. However, when policy is concerned, it tends to change. It is not fixed. It is rather a country-specific, it is time-specific, it is context-specific, and it changes with circumstances. So therefore, the People's Republic of China consistently insists other countries to reiterate their commitment to the One China principle, while we see that nations like India, the United States, and the European Union push forward their position on the One China principle, that is, their respective One China policy. Now, the question arises that why China is pushing forward their narrative of a One China principle, or their understanding of One China. The rationale of the intent behind pushing forward this idea, China's idea of One China principle, is to gain global legitimacy for the idea that One China, which is basically a claim that there is a valid, historically unified China, which includes not just the mainland China, but which also includes Tibet, Inner Mongolia, East Turkestan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and also the South China Sea. So it is very evident from this conversation that the entity we called One China, quote unquote, includes areas where the People's Republic of China usually faces dilemmas and issues of sovereignty, issues of legitimacy, issues of legality, issues of historical accuracy, and normative issues as well. So this is where we understand that the rationale behind China's transnational repression at the diplomatic and foreign policy level. Now, the objective, as we understand, of the transnational repression is not only repressing people or government, but rather it has a much more loftier motive, that is to push forward their own narrative, their idea of what one China is at the international stage, and at the same time repress any other forms of alternative narratives. When we speak of alternative narratives, you can understand that Tibet is currently illegally occupied by China. This is one of the narratives. Another issue could be the human rights violations in East Turkestan, the lack of freedom in Inner Mongolia, the unlawful surveillance that the speaker yesterday talked about. So these kind of narratives, the alternative narratives, the idea of one China that China pushes forward is also to repress those ideas. So therefore, what we see is that China continues to repress any challenges that comes forward in their own narrative by employing tactics like carrot and stick approach that is on the one hand, as Josh mentioned earlier, that we have seen countries which do not agree with the narratives of China, or with the narratives of one China policy or one China that they defined, are being punished. The NBA, like he has mentioned earlier, we have seen with the BMW, Professor Dibesh this morning spoke about of how BMW came up with His Holiness the Dalai Lama's code, and they were being punished right after, the NBA, for instance. But at the same time, what we see in this carrot and stick approach is that those countries that obliged or that support this China's accepted narrative in the interest of Chinese government are being rewarded or receive benefits from China's economic alliance, like how we see in the Belt and Road Initiative. Like if we talk about Belt and Road Initiative in this instance, we see that there are more number of countries from Africa who before initially have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but right now we see that the number of the diplomatic relations is dwindling because most of these nations are now establishing their diplomatic relations with China, and they're becoming a part of Belt and Road Initiative. And what we see is also that one of the countries, if it's UAE or Saudi Arabia, if I'm not wrong, who receives the maximum number of investment and economic aid from Belt and Road Initiative, actually, they don't, what I mean is that by becoming part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the issues that we see, the human rights violations in East Turkestan were not being raised by Saudi Arabia or the UAE, despite the fact that they have Islamic Brotherhood as we speak. So these are the carrot and stick approach that the China employs. So what we see over here is that there is a greater rupture reflected in the narratives as well. So we also see that kind of rupture being reflected in the changing dynamics in the diplomatic relations between two countries. For instance, if I were to speak of China's changing diplomatic relations with EU, why I speak of EU is, for instance, EU has always been projected as the normative power, as someone who sort of like leads other countries on norms and values and human rights, and the fact that it has a value-laden foreign policy. But the question arises, how does EU, as a normative power, continues to maintain its relationship with China, which is nevertheless an autocratic state, right? But who also pushes forward an alternative form of norms and values that does not comply with the existing norms and values. And this case study becomes, again, extremely interesting one, because EU at the time, back in 2001, if we reflect back, China was formally admitted into the World Trade Organization in 2001, and EU was one of the countries that supported China's entry into the WTO. And at the time, EU's idea of supporting China's entrance into WTO is based on the belief that China will develop into an open society, and bringing China to cooperate on issues like human rights, treatment of prisoners, and freedom of religion, and other value-oriented concerns. But today what we see is that in 2019, for the first time, the European Commission came up with a joint communication, which for the first time labeled China as a systemic rival, meaning that it is now challenging the existing world order that the European government and the United States and the Western nations have built. So we see this sudden shift from partner to rival, and that we see that for the first time, European Union is recognizing the kind of resistance and the challenge that China is carrying forward in terms of creating its own kind of narratives and putting forward its own interest first. So within the context of 3 minutes left, sorry. So within the context of One China principle itself, China has constantly demanded countries to resubscribe and reiterate their commitment to the One China principle. In turn, we see that the countries who have actually accepted to this or subscribed to this One China principle is accepting the entity called, quote-unquote, One China. And therefore, what we see is that initially the One China principle that was framed with regard to Taiwan is today what we see is that China, when it employs One China principle or One China, it employs this One China to any conversation that comes around not just Taiwan, but also Tibet, and also East Turkestan, Inner Mongolia, and South China Sea, and Hong Kong. In conclusion, therefore, what I would like to state here is that today what we see is that China's foreign policy today, I'm not an expert on foreign policy, I'm sure Josh would do a much better job in that, but today what we see is that China's foreign policy today is very different from Mao Zedong's era, or even for Deng Xiaoping's era. While we speak of Mao Zedong's era, there is an idea of spreading Mao's idea of communism globally, while during Deng Xiaoping's era, or even Jiang Zemin's era, the idea was laying low policy, and what we see is that they're more focused on building technology and in addressing domestic issues and developing economy and technology. But under Xi Jinping today, what we see is that the techniques that they employ is much more calculated, is much more sophisticated, and diverse set of methods. So China today is not, I would believe, is not just trying to be the global hegemon as a lot of people would believe, but rather I feel that it's trying to place its own narratives and claims at the level of universal norms, at the level of universal norms and values in order to gain its legitimacy. So therefore, when we talk about China's transnational repression policy, it is important to focus what is being actually repressed and the motive behind these repression. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hadla, for giving the presentations about One China policy and the principles, because many times we get confused about it. And in fact, this China's interchangeable, right, use of this One China policy and principles as per their convenience, their political convenience, is a matter which we need to really understand about and to deal with. And the new narrative and the inclusion of Tibet, East Turkestan, Mongolia, Southern Mongolia, into the landscape of this One China principle is another thing which is also very conflicting and very confusing also. In recent past, when Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, we have seen China aggressively, right, demanded, right. They were very rhetoric on this stance by telling all the world to uphold the One China principle. So we have seen that they were very rigorous in their own matters in holding, and they were very pushing on that. And we have seen that, and not just on Nancy Pelosi's visit. At any time, they were there to push the matter, which was not true, which is not based on truth. So therefore, I thank Dr. Hardin for the wonderful presentations, and we will not go into the concluding remarks because we have a limited time, because we have only 20 minutes to go. So I will open the floors to the audience for any questions and make it very simple. And rather than collecting different questions at one time, we'll make it one-one. Otherwise, it'll be a little confusing. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions over there?
Thank you very much. I'm Selina Morel from Society for Threatened People. I have a question for Mrs. Wang. Thank you very much for your important speech about transnational repression. It's actually a topic that we also work a lot on, and we have a lot of people telling us stories about that, that problem happening to them also in Switzerland. Now, I don't know how closely you follow the Swiss-China policy. Our Bundesrat, our government lately announced that they decided already over half a year ago that they don't take over the thematic sanctions of the European Union that were imposed in context of the atrocities happening in East Turkestan. And you talk about accountability, which is an important recommendation to also make all the other recommendations valid, because when you cannot create accountability, then I'm afraid that people who are victims of this transnational repression, that they don't have the trust to actually speak out. And I was wondering if you have advice also for situations like this, for small countries, for governments who, I mean, we advocate the Swiss government to also follow the European Union approach, but if in the absence of them following suit, what can we do, NGOs or other activists, to pressure, to motivate and convince Swiss government officials to create accountability? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You know, I've been asked so many times, you know, by what people in the West, whether it's from government or civil society, how do we address China's abusive human rights abuses inside the country? My answer is that you're aiming too high. How can you make sure that you're not complicit in China's human rights abuses? Because so much economic activities are involved, are part of China's human rights abuses. I mean, let's say, you know, the forced labor issues, all this, you know, companies like, I don't know, I know H&M is from which country? The H&M, the clothing company. Sweden. So, I mean, like, can you make sure your supply chain is not part of the, is not in any way implicated in the Uyghur forced labor? It's very, very hard to know. And if you, companies, I am talking to many companies, they either say, you know, we tried our best, we haven't found anything. It's very hard to know. If you can't get to the bottom of your supply chain, then don't do it. You know, unless you can be 100% sure that you're not implicated in forced labor, then don't do it. So this is just one example of a clothing company. Then let's say, you know, more egregious things, companies like Volkswagen. Volkswagen also still have a, you know, company in Xinjiang, a factory in Xinjiang. So that's obvious, right? You still operate a factory in a place that the government is committed crimes against humanity. So I mean, you know, the Swiss government didn't follow EU in terms of banning human rights, sanction human rights abuses. But how about how can you make sure, you know, your own companies, any kind of economic activities with China is not being, you know, part of the human rights abuses carried out by the Chinese government? You know, the other thing I didn't mention, and I really wanted to mention, is that, you know, in terms of transnational repression, oftentimes carried out by diplomats. You know, how do you expel them? Recently, the Canadian government expelled one Chinese diplomat who was, you know, threatening a Canadian parliament member. Those are the people you actually have direct power to get them get them out of your own country. So there are, different things you can do. Another thing, in terms of surveillance, a lot of Chinese surveillance companies are implicated in, transnational repression. And how do you make sure that they are not operating, making profit in your own country? Those things, definitely the governments can control. Let's not, aim so high about how to change the situation in Xinjiang, how to make sure that you're not a part of Xinjiang.
I might just add a couple of quick points to that excellent list. I think what you're getting is, what if your government doesn't give a crap, right? And I face this with the U.S. government too. Not that there aren't a lot of well-meaning people inside the U.S. government who do give a crap, but in general, an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and because of the corrupting influences pushing a lot of people in government and Congress in the other direction or to look the other way, it's really hard to make these people give a crap. A couple of things that I've seen work in the United States, naming and shaming, okay? And, NGOs play a key role in doing the research. I was really impressed by the Tibet Policy Institute, Tibet Action Institute research that I saw yesterday. Journalists, in a sense, what you're trying to do is you're trying to raise public awareness in order to put pressure on lawmakers, to put pressure on the government. That's essentially the game plan for these things, in my experience in Washington. The lawmakers pressure the administration, the people pressure the lawmakers, and the civil society raises the awareness to make all of that possible. So the research is really key. So journalists essentially are lazy. And we'll write it down, but we're not going to do all of that research, okay? But if you hand us a bunch of research, wow, well, that's a really good story. I'll definitely write that story. So I think naming and shaming these corporations is a big part of it. I think finding the examples, I think, that we've seen recently, for example, Thermo Fisher is a company that was selling DNA kits to the Chinese authorities in Xinjiang and Tibet. And because of a lot of good work by a lot of young activists, including Students for Free Tibet, they eventually stopped selling the kits to the police in Xinjiang. They still sell them to the police in Tibet. But anyway, we named them, we shamed them good, right? When it comes to the sanctions, I think it's really important to understand at least in the United States context, the different parts of the government and their different interests. So Treasury Department won't sanction China for human rights violations. It never happened. If you look through it, I mean, there's a couple of here and there, but they'll sanction China for helping Iran with its missile program or for shipping bullets and gunpowder to Russia, but never really. Those sanctions come from where? The State Department, sometimes the Commerce Department entity lists, and through things like the Global Magnitsky List, which is a law that allows sort of an alternate route for identifying specific sanction violators and using a different legislative power to get at them. So I think understanding the internal dynamics and who your internal allies in your government is really key. And then the last thing I think that's really important is that, a lot of these efforts, I think, get caught up in this idea of like, oh, well, you're going after China and you're singling out China. And why only China? Because it's true, there are a lot of countries that have transnational repression, especially inside the United States, the Saudis, just for one example. Tons of transnational repression. They're harassing, and I mean, they killed my colleague. That was in Turkey, so I guess that is transnational. But anyway, you get the point. When it happens in America, that's foreign interference. So the transnational repression falls under the larger umbrella of foreign interference. We don't have any foreign interference laws in the United States. They have them in Australia. It's not perfect, but it's a model. It's a step in the right direction. And what did they do? Well, they took China out of the equation. Any foreign interference. So if we don't have standards, and we don't have laws on foreign interference, well, then any effort to sort of, single out the Chinese government or Chinese officials or companies that are doing business in China, it's going to get immediate pushback. Oh, you're targeting China. You just want a Cold War, blah, blah, blah. But if you make foreign interference into the theme of the thing that you're fighting, then all of a sudden you've defanged that sort of disingenuous kind of line of attack. And you've also done something good, which is to also maybe set standards and norms and even laws and policies that will prevent foreign interference and foreign tampering and transnational repression from any despot or dictator. So that could only be to the good. And the last one is, I think you have to drain the swamp of money because, the question was, how are they paying for all this stuff, right? How does the Chinese government, which has a currency that doesn't work outside of China. Right? You can't take that currency out. You could make the Iranians buy some oil with some RMB, but they're just going to sell it and get dollars for it the next day. So where did they come up with all these billions to buy off all these politicians and universities? And of course, gets back to the United Front. They do it through proxies, but it's all enabled by Wall Street. It's all enabled by investments through the capital markets, which is a whole other panel. But until we stop giving them all of our money through passive investments and indexes and pension funds and transfers of wealth through corporate joint ventures and other means of transferring massive amounts of wealth into the hands of these companies that are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, and then are definitely going to use that leverage to advance their political agenda by tying it to our economic interests. That's a big ask, but I think at some point we're going to have to tackle that too.
Yes, please.
Thank you all for your very pretty diverse and also informative talks. And this question, I think, forms a neat continuation with Josh's add-on just now. There's many arguments to the effect that America's one China policy is purely nominal and doesn't actually inform policy. And you can cite American support for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Tibet, etc., as examples for that argument. But to turn it around, and I'm asking Josh, given his foreign policy experience, what are some ways in which you think the one China policy actually does have a meaningful impact on American policy? And even better, do you know any examples which relate to human rights and therefore the point of this conference?
Right. I thought your presentation on the difference between the One China policy and the One China principle was really excellent and really important. And it came up, of course, when former Foreign Minister Qin Gang came to speak to all the U.S. journalists, and he said the same thing. He said, the One China principle is the universal norm. Everybody agrees to it. And I said, we don't agree to it. And he's like, what are you talking about? America doesn't agree to it. We have a policy. You've got the principle. We've got the policy. And so he didn't understand the One China principle, and he apparently didn't understand the One Wife principle. But that's besides the point. Sorry, Qin Gang. He can't respond because you could say anything. Anyway, the point is that the reason that that's such a hot button issue in Washington today is because the debate is not over whether or not the One China policy is sufficient enough to maintain U.S. Commitment and resources and attention to what it implies, which is that if we're going to back it up with our actual military and diplomatic and financial power, if it's challenged, okay? If they try to say, no, the One China principle, not the One China policy. And remember, the One China policy is that we don't have a view on the principle. And it's connected indirectly to our policy of strategic ambiguity, which is that we don't tell anybody whether or not we're actually going to come to Taiwan's defense in the event of an invasion. And I think when you listen to the discussion about the One China policy in Washington, it inevitably leads to the follow-on discussion of whether or not it's time to abandon the policy of strategic ambiguity. And my views on that are basically irrelevant, but it seems at least clear to me that America's commitment to the One China policy and America's commitment to strategic ambiguity are up for debate. And I say that very sadly, because what I think I'm saying is that if President Trump gets reelected again, neither of those things will really matter. Because I interviewed President Trump for my book, and what he told me was that Taiwan is 2 feet away from China, and we're 8,000 miles away, and if China attacks, there isn't anything we can do about it. All right. So for him, although there was a perception in Taiwan, and a similar one amongst Uyghurs, and a similar one amongst Taiwanese, and maybe Tibetans too, that President Trump was really strong anti-CCP and this and that, and really supportive of all of these minority groups and these ethnic rights for ethnic minorities inside China, but also rights for Chinese people and human rights. It wasn't true. Okay, there were people inside the Trump administration who cared deeply about those things, but not President Trump. He doesn't care about any of that. He's the one who said Hong Kong protesters were rioters. He's the one who told Xi Jinping that the Uyghur concentration camps were exactly the right thing to do. Okay, that's what he said to the president of China in the middle of or the general secretary of China, excuse me. So my point is that, if we don't have our act together, it really doesn't really matter, what it says on paper, what U.S. policy is. And in a future Trump administration, those people who cared about human rights will not be invited back, okay? Trump 2.0 will be the crazy half and not the non-crazy half of the Republican Party. Trump 1.0 was half and half. Sometimes the crazy people won, sometimes the non-crazy people won, okay? I sided generally as an opinion columnist with the non-crazy people, okay, who believed in things, okay, and had values, okay? And the crazy people who believe in nothing and have no values other than America first and racism and homophobia and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and all the rest, the ugly, ugly part of that movement, that's what a Trump 2.0 administration would be, and then all bets are off. So, a lot of the people like to say, oh, well, look at Joe Biden's presidency. Look, everything went to crap, and now we've got wars in Israel and Ukraine, and Trump didn't have any wars. Well, I'm telling you that Trump 2.0 would make this academic discussion of the one China principle versus the one China policy moot, because all U.S. policy, we could pull out of NATO, forget about, you think he's going to care about the Quad, you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't know what the Quad is. So, I don't know if that really answers your question, except to say that, we can't fight authoritarianism and exclusion by becoming the thing that we're fighting. We can't defend our values unless we live up to our values. That's my belief. And we're not doing that right now. And I hope it gets better, but it could get worse.
We'll go for the last question, Andrew Zoller.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise another facet of the issue of the repression.
Mrs. Zoller, can you be very clear, a little louder? And
no, I will be short. I just want to say that the Chinese policy is a global policy in terms of surveillance and repression, and that China is active here in Geneva, in the UN system, and systematically, over the last 10 years, destroying the system of procedures to protect people, and that this is ongoing. I quote Geneva. I could also quote other intergovernmental organizations, in particular Interpol, for instance. They are transforming the international system into tools to repress not only the Chinese, but also all those who provide information on what happens in China. I think that this is fundamental for the future, and that one has to be aware of that dimension.
thank you for the comments. So, ma'am, the last question.
Thank you. I am Nicole. I'm supposed to speak later on, but then I just like to echo very shortly Mrs. Zoller, as well as all the speakers today. I think it is vitally important to differentiate between the Chinese so-called one China principle and one China policy, which is extremely different fundamentally. Policies are as Dr. Ladin mentioned, it can be very different from administration to administration. What Chinese are doing right now is that they will usually say that, oh, you all agree with me already, as Josh mentioned, that you have agreed that one China principle is what you have signed up your diplomatic relation with us, the Chinese, when you establish diplomatic relation. But then, if we look at the joint communique countries signed with China, exactly as Josh mentioned, not everybody agrees that the Chinese are saying that you all agree with me that Taiwan is part of China, because people very carefully, diplomats in the old times, very carefully choose the words. They either, some of them do acknowledge, recognize the Chinese One China principle. Some very carefully say that we acknowledge. Some may even say that we take note of what you mentioned as a One China principle. They obviously did not all agree with what the Chinese are saying. So I think, but then obviously not many people would be going back to their joint communique while 40 years ago, 50 years ago signed up the diplomatic relation with China. And then that is why I think China is now able to sell their narrative. And exactly as Dr. Laden mentioned, that they are trying to sell their story, their narrative, with hidden intention behind it. That's very important note I think we need to take off today. It's not only about Taiwan, but then it could be many things. And exactly as Mr. Zola mentioned, they are systematically changing and revamping the UN system, which is actually the, during my later on remarks, I would like to share with you a few first-hand experience that we witness here. I'm sure that a lot of you may find it interesting and, to be honest, quite scary indeed. So that's my short remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. So we'll wind up the sessions with the presentations of souvenir as an appreciation, talking of appreciations to all the speakers. So thank you all the speakers, and thank you all the audience for listening to this theme. So, ladies first. Thank you. And never give up. Thank you, Coach. Now we have a tea session, and after that we'll conclude for the